There is a genetic signal that should not exist. Not there, not like that. It was not the invaders. The old legend of a people sailing in from the east collapses under modern DNA. It was not simple absorption either, the story where a civilization just disappears into Rome. And it was not hiding where the biggest study ever done on the region actually looked. Something survived, but not where anyone expected it to survive. This is Tuscany. These are the Etruscans. The old story was not false, it was unfinished. And the real answer is smaller, stranger, and heavier. Start with the land, because the land is where this gets strange first. Somewhere between the Tiber and the Arno, in what is now Tuscany, western Umbria, and northern Lazio, there was once a civilization that fit nowhere near its neighbors. Its metalworkers were producing bronze and gold work that outclassed most of the Mediterranean. Its tombs were carved and painted with banquets, dancers, and color that still holds after 25 centuries underground. Women appear in Etruscan tomb art, reclining beside men at feasts named, honored, present in a way that shocked, later, Greek and Roman writers who considered it scandalous. And its language belonged to no known family. Not Latin, not Greek, not Indo-European at all, as far as anyone can tell. Strange on its own because by the time the civilization was flourishing, Indo-European languages had already spread across most of the continent surrounding it. Thousands of inscriptions survive, over 13,000 of them, carved into tombs, painted on pottery, stamped into mirrors and dice and votive offerings. Scholars can read the letters because the Etruscans borrowed a version of the Greek alphabet. They still cannot fully explain what most of the words mean. A civilization this advanced, this wealthy, this connected to Rome and Greece through trade, war, and marriage left behind a language that resisted every attempt to place it. And once a mystery like that exists, people rush to fill it with a story. The ancient world had its own theory, and it came from Herodotus. He wrote that during a long famine in Lydia, in western Anatolia, the population split in two to survive. Half stayed home under one prince, half sailed west under his brother, a leader named Tyrrhenus, and landed in Italy, becoming the Etruscans. It is a clean story: migration, memory, a named leader, a reason for leaving. It gave the Etruscans their Greek name Tyrrhenoi, and gave the sea beside them its name too. But a few centuries later, a different writer looked at the same evidence and reached the opposite conclusion. Dionysius of Halicarnassus argued the Etruscans were native to Italy, unlike any other people in language, religion, or custom, and pointed out that even a Lydian historian, writing about his own homeland, never mentioned this migration at all. Two respected ancient writers, same civilization, total disagreement. That contradiction sat unresolved for over 2,000 years, waiting for something more precise than legend and rhetoric to settle it. Modern genetics was supposed to be that something. For a while, it looked like it would finally close the case for good. But even the language itself refuses to sit still. For most of modern history, Etruscan was treated as a true isolate, a language with no relatives at all, floating alone in the middle of Indo-European Europe. More recent linguistic work has grouped it into a small, strange family alongside two other languages, one spoken far to the north in the eastern Alps, one spoken on the Greek island of Lemnos, over 1,000 kilometers away by sea. That connection is real, documented, and still not fully explained. A shared linguistic ancestor, stretching from central Italy to an Aegean island, does not fit neatly into either the migration legend or the total absorption story. It is its own small mystery sitting quietly inside the bigger one, and it will not be the last piece of evidence here that refuses to point in only one direction. Here is where the old explanation earns its keep, because it was not stupid and it was not baseless. Rome absorbed Etruria piece by piece through the 4th, 3rd, and 2nd centuries BCE, and by the 1st century BCE, the last independent Etruscan cities were gone. The language stopped appearing in new inscriptions. No separate Etruscan state survived into the empire. If you only look at politics and language, the Etruscans really did disappear, and that part of the story is true and well documented. But the disappearance of a language is not the same as the disappearance of a population. A state can fall silent, a language can stop being written. A people does not simply stop existing because its cities lost their independence. That gap between political death and biological continuity is exactly where genetics stepped in centuries later, and exactly where the simple story stopped being enough. Large ancient DNA studies eventually got access to real Iron Age remains from Etruria and its surroundings. A study published in the journal Science in 2019 analyzed genomes recovered from in and around Rome across thousands of years, including individuals buried in Etruscan-era sites. A larger follow-up study, published in Science Advances in 2021, pushed further, sequencing dozens of ancient individuals spanning roughly 18 centuries, from the Iron Age through the early Middle Ages, across sites in Tuscany, Lazio, and southern Italy. And what these studies found broke the migration legend at the root. The Etruscans, genetically, looked almost indistinguishable from their Latin neighbors living just down the road in Rome. Same broad ancestral mixture built from earlier European hunter-gatherer, Anatolian farmer, and steppe-related populations that had already spread across Iron Age Europe centuries earlier. No detectable trace of a fresh population arriving from Anatolia during the Etruscan period. Herodotus' famine, his ship, his prince named Tyrrhenus, none of it shows up in the bones. That should have been the end of the mystery. A clean, satisfying answer. No migration, just a local Italian population that happened to preserve an older language while its neighbors shifted toward newer ones. Tidy. Except it is not the end. Because if the ancient Etruscans were not genetically distinct from Rome, not exotic, not imported from anywhere, then what is the signal that keeps surfacing in modern Tuscany? Because there is one. And by every broad rule of genetics, it should not be there. Long before the big ancient genome studies existed, other researchers had already been looking closely at the mitochondrial DNA of living Tuscans, the maternal line, passed down mother to daughter across generations, largely undisturbed by the wider mixing that reshapes broader ancestry over time. And in certain communities, not spread evenly across the region, but concentrated in specific towns, they found something unusual: elevated frequencies of maternal lineages linked to Anatolia and the Near East, far above background levels, clustered tightly instead of scattered widely. One line of research pointed to a small town called Merlo, where Near Eastern maternal lineages appeared at a rate researchers described as too high to explain by chance alone. Another pointed to the island of Elba, where a rare mitochondrial branch, later connected to deep Anatolian ancestry, turned up at a frequency almost impossible to dismiss as noise. This is where you have to slow down, because two things that sound like contradictions are both true at the same time. The broad, ancient genome evidence says no distinct migrant population. The Etruscans looked like everyone else in Iron Age Italy. The narrow modern evidence says a real, elevated, Near Eastern-linked maternal thread sits inside a handful of Tuscan communities today. Both findings are published. Both are taken seriously by researchers. And neither one cancels the other out. They simply do not belong in the same sentence because they are not answering the same question. To understand how that is even possible, it helps to stop thinking about a whole region and start thinking about a single valley. Picture an inland Tuscan hill town, the kind built around a stone church square with a handful of family surnames that have barely changed in centuries. For generations, most people born there stayed there, and most people who married in came from a cluster of nearby villages, not from across the country or across the sea. Not isolation for its own sake, simply what rural life in central Italy looked like for a very long time, before roads, before railways, before anyone thought to ask what a valley like this was carrying inside it. Picture the same rhythms repeating year after year, the same small set of surnames on the gravestones behind the church, the same families intermarrying because there was rarely anyone else nearby to marry, the same fields worked by the same handful of households across generations who had no reason to think of themselves as carrying anything unusual at all. This is not a reconstructed scene with real named people or real recorded words. It is a way to picture the mechanism. A town shaped like this can carry a genetic thread for 2,000 years without a single person in it knowing what they hold, simply because almost nothing came in to dilute it, and almost nothing left to spread it further outward. Multiply that pattern across a scattering of similar towns and islands across the region, each one sealed off just enough, for just long enough, and you start to see how a signal could survive at exactly the scale researchers were not originally built to look for. That mechanism is the crack running underneath both simple explanations at once, and it is also the twist. Researchers examining this exact tension made an argument that reframes the entire search. If descendants of the ancient Etruscan population survived into the present, their genetic trace would not necessarily appear when the region is sampled broadly. It would only be detectable at a much smaller scale, in specific towns where population movement stayed limited for centuries, because a real signal can dissolve into statistical invisibility the moment researchers zoom out to cover an entire province. In other words, the large ancient genome studies were never going to find a distinct Etruscan population at the regional level, because a distinct population may never have existed at that scale to begin with. It may only ever have existed, if it still exists at all, in fragments, inside places too small for the broad studies to notice, the same way a single word disappears the moment you skim an entire library instead of opening the one book where it happens to appear. Sit with that for a second, because it changes what this mystery was actually about. This was never a story where scientists got it wrong and needed correcting. The ancient genome data is solid. The modern mitochondrial DNA is also solid. The problem was never the evidence itself. The problem was the size of the question being asked of it. And there is something uncomfortable sitting underneath that reframing. The forces that usually erase a people's distinct identity, isolation, poverty, and being overlooked by the wider currents of history moving through Rome, through Florence, through the coastal trade routes, may be the same forces that, in a handful of these towns, quietly protected a thread of it instead. That is not a triumphant story. It is a quieter, sadder one. Continuity here, if it is real, was not carried forward by pride or memory passed proudly down through generations who knew what they held. It may have been carried by nobody noticing it all. None of this settles into certainty, and it should not be forced to. The dating on these mitochondrial lineages is genuinely disputed. Some researchers argued the Near Eastern signal in Tuscan mitochondrial DNA reflects very deep ancestry, stretching back 5,000 years or more, long before anything resembling Etruscan culture existed. Other researchers, working with larger modern genetic datasets, have argued the signal looks more recent, arriving after the Etruscan period rather than during it, with no clear founding event tying it to any single migration. That disagreement has not been resolved, and newer research on neighboring Iron Age populations along the Adriatic side of Italy has found real regional differences in ancestry across the peninsula, a reminder that ancient Italy was never one uniform genetic population to begin with. There is also a deeper limit underneath all of it. The Villanovan culture, whose material remains are thought to have developed directly into what became the Etruscans, cremated their dead. Cremation destroys the DNA that would let researchers test the earliest chapter of this story directly. That is not a cover-up. It is a gap in what survived, the same kind of gap archives leave everywhere, and it means some questions here may never fully close. There is another layer worth pausing on, because it shows this genetic story did not end with the Etruscans at all. The same 2021 study that found no Anatolian migration during the Etruscan period also traced what happened to this population afterward, across the centuries of the Roman Empire and into the early Middle Ages. During the imperial period, the ancestry of people living in the same stretch of central Italy shifted again, and shifted hard. A large, population-wide increase in ancestry linked to the Eastern Mediterranean, consistent with the sheer scale of movement, trade, and slavery that came with running an empire. Centuries later, after Rome fell, a different shift appears, this time bringing in ancestry linked to populations further north in Europe. In plain terms, the region absorbed multiple waves of people long after the Etruscans had already politically vanished, layered one on top of another like sediment, which means any Near Eastern signal detectable in modern Tuscans could, in theory, be sitting on top of several possible origin points, not just one. That is precisely why the dating dispute among the mitochondrial researchers matters so much. It is also why no single test run once on one town can settle a question this layered. None of this is a reason to treat DNA as the final word on who anyone is. A genetic signal can point toward a region, a corridor, a plausible ancestor population centuries back. It cannot tell you what a name meant to the person who carried it, what a saint's day looked like in a specific piazza, what a grandmother taught a daughter about which herbs to plant near the door. A haplogroup, one of these old lineage markers passed down largely unchanged through direct maternal or paternal lines, is a thread, not a biography. It complicates a historical picture, it does not replace one. The safer reading of all of this evidence is also, somehow, the more interesting one, not a bloodline preserved in triumph, but a set of overlapping traces that modern science is only now developing the tools to even ask about responsibly. So, the evidence has to work as layers instead of one final verdict. The ancient genomes say the Etruscans were not a separate imported population. That layer is broad, and it is strong. The modern mitochondrial studies say something distinct still lingers inside specific isolated communities. That layer is narrow, contested, and unresolved. The written record from antiquity preserves a 2,000-year-old disagreement between two ancient authors who could not settle the same question using nothing but oral tradition and observation. And the language, still only partly understood after 13,000 surviving inscriptions, sits there as a quiet reminder that something about this culture resisted full absorption long after its cities fell silent. None of these layers replaces the others. None of them alone tells the whole story. DNA did not invent this mystery, and it did not fully solve it either. It exposed exactly where the old explanations stopped being enough, and exactly where a newer, narrower one had to begin. That is the real shape of what happened here. Not a hidden bloodline, waiting 2,000 years to be triumphantly rediscovered on camera. Something quieter than that. A population that was never as foreign as the old legend claimed, and never as gone as the simpler, modern explanation assumed. Somewhere in between those two comfortable stories sits the harder, more specific truth, that survival, if it happened at all, happened at the scale of a single valley, a single island, a single mitochondrial line, small enough to hide inside the ordinary lives of people who never knew they were carrying the answer to a question historians had been arguing about since Herodotus first wrote it down. Go back to where this started, a genetic signal that should not exist, according to the biggest study ever done on the region. It is not that the big study was wrong, it is that it was answering a different question than the one certain Tuscan villages were quietly holding the answer to the entire time. The map did not need to be redrawn, it needed to be zoomed in. And once you understand that a signal this old can hide successfully inside a place too small and too overlooked for anyone to think to check, you have to ask a much bigger question. What else has been declared vanished, extinct, or fully absorbed simply because nobody looked at the right size? How many languages, ceremonies, bloodlines, and buried corridors are still sitting inside towns nobody thought to zoom in on, waiting for someone to stop looking at the whole map and start looking at the one place where the thread never actually broke? The Etruscans were never a mystery because they disappeared. They were a mystery because disappearance was never the right word for what actually happened to them.